join you live from COP26 for this event on the importance of quality education in advancing climate justice and youth leadership, co-hosted by Plan International, Save the Children, Transform Education, UNICEF UK, Send My Friend to School, and Malala Fund. My name is Ines Yabar. I am Senior Global Campaigns Coordinator at Restless Development and Youth Activist from Transform Education. Now, the role in advancing climate justice and enabling child-youth leadership in climate policy processes, while increasing recognized, is not sufficiently addressed within national commitments. At the same time, millions of children have their access to safe, quality education impacted every year due to the impacts of the climate crisis. Yet there is no better way to prepare future citizens for the important role they will play in safeguarding our planet and its nature than environmental education. And no better way to learn when education is delivered in schools safe from climate shocks. Whilst youth climate activists have been highlighting the importance of education as a climate solution, including at the brilliant event in the New York Times Climate Hub earlier this week that had Vanessa, Malala, and Leah, as we've seen so far at COP26, it has been woefully overlooked by leaders. This is why I'm delighted to moderate this event in dialogue today, exploring the role of education in advancing other agendas under the Paris Agreement. This includes adaptation, mitigation, financing, and the importance of right-based, gender-just approach to tackling the climate crisis. I did want to note that although we would have loved to have this be more inclusive with interpretation and to provide better inclusion in this COP that has been quite closed, the different technical difficulties and last-minute requests have not allowed that. So we look forward to bringing this discussion after COP to make sure that it is more inclusive and having those conversations with you all. And also, we know that a lot of people are watching us online. We are grateful for that and hope we can have a chat. So do send your questions through the COP platform. We are joined today by a lot of speakers, some here in person and some online. First of all, David Boyd, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. We have Umesh Balal Magar, Network Coordinator at the Nepalese Youth for Climate Action. Welcome, Umesh. We have Amy Wickham, Climate and Energy Specialist from UNICEF, online with us. Also, Rose Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer at Plan UK, and Chandel O'Neill, Sustainable Energy Specialist and Human Rights Advocate from Trinidad and Tobago, and last but not least, Harjeet Singh, Senior Advisor for CAN International. Welcome to you all. So, as I said before, if you're joining us on the COP26 platform, don't forget you can share any questions for our speakers in the chat box. And I would like to invite our first speaker, Mr. David Boyd, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, to take the floor. You have 5 minutes. Of course, it seems we have some technical difficulties, so we'll go to a video and hopefully, David, we can come back to you.
Today I am going to talk about climate change and its impacts to girls and young women. In our community, we have experienced the following climate change effects: floods, shifting of rainfall patterns, and droughts. Climate change is affecting our lives in many ways. It threatens the ability to make our dreams to come true. This climate change has resulted in the following challenges: water contamination, food insecurity, loss of livelihoods, and the death of livestock. From our own perspectives, we have experienced that climate change has made gender inequality worse and increased sexual abuse. We are tasked to work for a long distances in search of water when local water supplies are contaminated or when they are very low. When water is inaccessible to us, it affects our menstrual hygiene process, and we miss classes until the period is ended. When it floods during school hours, girls are forced to stay in classrooms and travel home during the night. When our community's livelihoods is affected by climate change and struggling to raise money, girls are taken out of school as a way of saving money for food sourcing, and they are even married off to older men and never return to school. When our homes are destroyed by climate change, girls are sheltered in unsafe places. These are the challenges that we are facing as girls and young women.
We want our communities to take action to address the looming challenges of climate change. And this includes changing the behaviors as well as some of the practices and ensuring that our communities better adopt to better ways of managing the environment. It also involves ensuring that those people that are most affected are at the heart and engaged in solutions and decision making. We ask governments to urgently mitigate the impacts facing girls and young women, especially those that directly and indirectly affect our access to education. We have a right to education and to learn about climate change. Education systems, therefore, must be more resilient to reduce the chance of us missing schools and learning. Governments should build more schools, change the school calendars to accommodate for altered seasons, and establish satellite schools, as well as including climate action in all aspects of the school curriculum. We want more opportunities like this to conduct our own research, share our own stories and ideas with decision makers within our communities and countries, but also in global spaces. Girls and young women from rural communities in Zambia do not have many opportunities like this to engage in decision making, even though we are most affected. We want this to change, and we want our voices to be heard.
Thank you. So the video that we showed, the short film, had two researchers who couldn't be here in person because of numerous challenges in accessing COP this year. We're glad that we were able to have them, at least via video. Now, I would like to turn our focus onto our exciting panel, joining us live in Scotland and hopefully also on the virtual platform, on the impacts of the climate crisis on education and challenges in advancing the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, only those registered for COP have access to the COP26 platform that limited also virtual speakers and participants. Please do keep your answers short, up to 3 minutes, and highlight any key issues emerging from COP26 in your answer. I will unfortunately need to cut you at 3 minutes if you reach that, but that way we'll all have an equal opportunity to speak. So, Umis, I'd like to come first to you. Based on your experiences, how has climate change and environmental degradation impacted yours and others' access to safe, quality education in Nepal, in particular for indigenous children and youth and those with disabilities?
Okay, once again, thank you so much for your beautiful introduction and for the question. Actually, I am Umesh from Nepal, but I don't think that actually my name matters who I am. But it matters which voice I am bringing here, from where I am, and from what specifically vulnerable community I am. And I belongs to the community of indigenous and person with disabilities. The climate change is affecting all over the world. It is a universal problem, and no one is apart from this. But our house is burning, and we are sinking. But we are not in the same boat. Our boat is narrow, and our boat is more vulnerable than others. We, the youth and the children, and also the person with disabilities, are in the different boat with more risks with climate change. And indigenous community and indigenous community are dependent in the nature. They are dependent in the climate, in nature. They are dependent in the forest. Their livelihood are directly dependent to the nature. And climate change has bad effect, severe bad effect on the nature. And due to the effect on the nature, their livelihood change. They have to shift to the other, and so that may disturb their livelihood. And children of that community, had to be engaged or more other in the other things. So they may affect the education system because they don't have time to go to the school, or they have to be encouraged to support their family to support that. Similarly, the person with disability has also the same case, but I would rather to say that they have the more severe case than the person with the indigenous community, because climate disaster hit them in the front, hit them badly than other. They are in the front line of the climate disaster, but they are less likely to be talked in the table of discussion. Because during the education, or in my experience, during the education or during the way to the school or college, and the climate disaster hit them because they have no accessible road, they have no accessible buildings, and climate change can bring the high precipitation or landslide flood. So this that are the obstacle to the person with disabilities to their home, to the school. So these are the cases that person with disabilities and a person with indigenous may face due to the climate change in the education axis. Thank you.
Thank you, Umes, and perfect timing. I think I can see some people joining us online. That's perfect. We'll come to you in a minute, but I wanted to go to Harjeet next. My question to you is, to what extent is education included in loss and damage discussions broadly and in the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage?
Thank you, Ines, for having me. And this is a very important question, because as we speak in the negotiations, loss and damage has become such an important issue. We are talking about range of impacts. Traditionally, we have been only looking at conventional disasters like floods and cyclones and drought, but loss and damage, when we talk about in the climate change context, has really widened the whole perspective. We are talking about slow onset events much more, such as sea level rise, desertification, ocean acidification, glacier melt. But these issues are still very new, and the global community is not yet ready to understand what kind of impacts it will have on people and how to grapple. Even I would say a country like the Netherlands, who's known as championing living, at a lower sea level, is still struggling. So how are we as global community going to respond? So the specific impact on education has not yet seen so much of discussion happening on, when it comes to impact that I said, particularly on slow onset events. So it is really important for us to bring in the whole perspective of education. But at the same time, the good thing that we have seen, because we now have Warsaw International Mechanism, which has three functions: knowledge generation, coordination, and action and support. So from the knowledge generation perspective, we have seen a lot of research institutions who have started looking into some of these areas. And Warsaw International Mechanism has also set up expert groups that are going to start doing research and more knowledge generation in this area. So education per se, when we talk about how when disasters hit, school buildings gets destroyed, or how we see dropouts, particularly impact on girls. We need to look at how the learning outcome gets impacted. So those specific issues are still not on the table. So discussions like these are important to understand those specific impacts, and we need to make sure that Warsaw International Mechanism picks up those issues, and we can get many more organizations and research institutions involved in particularly, and I keep emphasizing whenever I talk about climate impacts, the slow onset events, because I also come from a humanitarian community, and I see humanitarian community has still not integrated the aspects of slow onset events like sea level rise, desertification, glacial melt, and so on. So I would say we are still not there in terms of connecting the impact of these disasters specifically on education, and what education sector can contribute in terms of dealing with these impacts. So a lot more work is needed when it comes to loss and damage and Warsaw International Mechanism, but we have made a start.
Thank you, Harjeet. And you've jumped ahead to our next session, where hopefully we'll talk about the solutions as well, and I'm sure you can bring more insights on that. Let's turn to Chandel. What are your current challenges, challenges in climate finance from an education and youth perspective, and what are the gaps that you're seeing?
Well, from my perspective, what I've picked up on when it comes to education, it seems like, okay, youth coming out of university have a lot of debt, and that comes with taking loans and everything. So with that, you're already starting at a disadvantage. So you can't necessarily start a business or get on upper hand or get a house, all these kind of things, just live a good life, because you're starting with a little debt burden. And also generally because you're a youth, there's a lot of stigma, a lot of like moving around, like a bureaucracy and trying to just get access to finance. They say like, you need to be established for 3 years, but you need to have all this experience. But how do you get experience if they won't give you an opportunity? So it just seems like a lot of running around and a lot of bureaucracy that you try to navigate. And it comes with going into fellowship programs. It comes with going to school and possibly going into more debt, but it's also a means to an end. Like you have more education that shows you're more ready to take on these burdens, even though you may be ready qualified, but sometimes you just need the paper trail behind you to say, yo, you can do this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just writing down paper trail. I think that's something that we see all over the world and in all our communities. I think everyone relates to that. Let's move on to Rose. My question to you is, what are the impacts of the climate crisis on girls' education specifically, and to what extent is the importance of girls' education recognized in the Action for Climate Empowerment Work Programme and the Gender Action Plan?
Sure, thank you. So I guess we know that climate change is not gender neutral. In fact, climate change is sexist, and so women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, and along with other marginalised groups such as those with disabilities or Indigenous people. And often those groups are also less well equipped to deal with climate change. They have less assets, perhaps less skills and training. So, you know, obviously the primary effects of climate change on education and on girls' education is the stuff that's obvious. And I think Hajit spoke about this when classrooms are destroyed, or there's a shortage of teachers due to climate-related migration. But actually the secondary impacts of climate change are potentially more damaging and long-lasting. And that's when we see adolescent girls dropping out of school, particularly in those countries that are most affected by climate change. And let me just give you some stats on that. It's estimated that in 2021, climate-related events are estimated to prevent at least 4 million girls in low and middle income countries complete their education. If we continue on our current trajectory without taking any action, it's estimated by 2025 that will increase to 12.5 million girls prevented from getting an education. And this is particularly concerning because we know that once girls are out of education, it is less likely that they will return to it, particularly if they become pregnant or get married. But so not only does this prevent them of their rights to an education, but it also means that they are less well equipped and have less skills to deal with climate adaptation and to take part in the green economy. You also asked about the impact, you know, the effectiveness of the Action for Climate Empowerment. And, you know, from our perspective, the recent review of it does not really reflect the gender impact of climate change enough. It does mention it does mention women and youth, but it does not particularly focus on girls. And we really feel that more needs to be done to give girls and the importance of girls' education more predominance in this process. And again, the Gender Action Plan is a vital mechanism in the UNFCCC mechanism, and we're pleased that it does reference gender inequality in the role of women, but once again, we feel that much more emphasis and attention needs to be given to the role of girls and youth.
Thank you. I would love to check if we have David or Amy with us. It seems they're still not here with us. So we may go to some... Oh, we may have Amy hand on for a minute. We can potentially have Amy with us online. And I can see no questions coming yet, but remember that you can add comments in the site. So we do have Amy with us. Amy, welcome. We're glad that you could join us. So my question to you is, what are the challenges in framing girls' education as a solution to climate change? And how do we center a rights-based, gender-just approach? Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you for the great question. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Brilliant. So to start, I will say the correlation between girls' education and climate change is is extremely complex, but also really important. While the education of girls can be a major contributor to addressing climate change, we know that lots of other factors can undermine the effect on climate change. Some reports have suggested that educating girls could see a reduction in CO2 emissions, but these statistics are sometimes also suggesting and drawing on connections between education and family planning. And this is an extremely challenging narrative, and it can undermine girls' and women's rights and undervalue the power of education. Girls are not responsible for the climate crisis, and they're also not responsible for solving it. We risk girls' education being viewed as an end rather than as a good in and of itself, a right and a critical pillar of ensuring gender justice. And moreover, energy consumed is unequal. For instance, somebody in the UK will take just 5 days to emit the same amount of carbon as somebody in Rwanda does in an entire year. So this grave risk is that we promise a change which is not solely the remit and under the control of education and the education of girls. Instead, we should promote the power of education, in particular for girls, in terms of enabling them to participate in the green economy, to develop STEM skills, learn and advocate for their rights, and be empowered as climate activists as they already are. Centering a rights-based, gender-just approach means working with and for girls to ensure that every girl realizes her right to education and for what this means for her family, but not for what this means for her family, but for what this means for her future. And we also need to be careful to not further entrench some of these traditional discriminations against girls by linking their education. And this is all quite a bit of the Declaration on Children, Youth and Climate Action, which was developed together with young people. And many of you may be familiar, this declaration that sets out the need to equip children to equip children and young people with the knowledge and skills required to protect themselves and contribute to a safe and sustainable future. UNICEF, together with co-custodians of this declaration, Youngo and the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, calls on governments to place children's rights and children's voices at the centre of climate action by aligning with this declaration, and to use this approach to guide their work on education, particularly for girls and climate mitigation.
Thank you. I'm not sure if we have David with us yet. Apparently not, but we'll keep you on the line, Amy. More questions coming to you. I'm interested to come to our panel. So we're here at COP26, and we've been talking about lots of groups that are discriminated, whether they're youth, whether they're women, whether they're people with disabilities, people in different countries. What do you think the role of this conference is in advancing that agenda and supporting them? I know I'm kind of ad-libbing off the fact that we're still waiting for David. Does anyone have any thoughts on that, and what your role here is at the conference in bringing that message of those communities that aren't necessarily represented? Does anyone want to pick that up? Yeah, go ahead, Chandel.
I'll jump in. Okay, I'm Chandel from Trinidad and Tobago, small island developing state. Generally, to get to COP is my government sending a delegation, and my government will not respond to my emails, won't answer my questions from like the Environmental Management Authority and all that. So me getting to COP, going like through the team I'm working with, Unite for Climate Action, is showing that youth, we can do it DIY style. Like you just find a way, you work around the system, you navigate the bureaucracy, and we can do it. You just have to try and set your mind to something. So I think me sitting here, me being here is just a proof that like they will tell you can't do it. They'll tell you all the ways you shouldn't do it, all the ways it's impossible, or maybe you're trying too hard. But like if you really want to do something, set your mind to it, and you can get there. And when you get there, it'll be a little scary, but you came this far, so you might as well keep trying.
I love that message, and I can see people nodding. Anyone else would like to take that question?
Yeah, I think it's so vital that this climate crisis is going to affect not me so much, but my children and future generations. And it's so important that the voice of young people is at the heart of what's been said here and the decisions that are being made. They cannot be excluded because this is their future, and it's absolutely vital that they are at the table bringing their views, and that they're listened to and they're involved in formulating those policies that will impact their future. So I think it's absolutely vital that youth and those groups that are most affected by this climate crisis are at the table.
Thank you, Rose. Harjeet, I saw you wanted to answer too.
So yeah, we are trying to do things in these conference centers where we speak to governments, talk to them about the impacts that people are facing. We also reach out to media to talk about these impacts so that there's much more awareness about how communities are getting impacted and the role young people can play, and we have seen how they have really inspired us. And we also have been attending climate marches, and that has been extremely inspiring experience on how young people in particular are understanding the whole concept of climate justice. They are talking about the role that they have to play. They are challenging the governments, and it's important that their voices are brought into these negotiating spaces so that our policymakers can hear what messages young people are sending. And yeah, we have to basically talk about the intergenerational rights. So it's important to see what happens here in the conference room and hallways and what happens outside, because eventually we are fighting for the world outside, and impacts are increasing, and the process here is moving still very, very slow. So we have to keep the pressure on.
Great message. Umis, I saw you on.
Yeah, we are here from all over the country. Moreover, we, the youth, are here to pressurize the government and the world leader who are in the power. And from all over the world, we, the youth, are here with a different youth status paper, with a different climate change issue from their respective country. And this is the historic day, because this decision going to make the future, determine the future, what type of future we have. And also I want to remind to the old leaders and who have the power to make the decision that we'll going to rewrite the history, that in the future we will surely remember the each and everybody who are here to make the decision that what type of decision they're going to make us. If they made us the cool decision that make our future bright, we'll remember them with happy face. And if they make our future bad with the greed of the economy or something else, and do not agree for the bright future, then we also surely remember them, but situation will be different. So it is up to the world leaders and to the all powerful person what kind of history they want to make by themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we still have Amy on the line? Would love to bring you in, Amy. I know Harjeet was talking about the relationship between here inside and the world outside. I know you're not here with us, but I think it's very important to have those two together. What are your thoughts about this kind of dichotomy?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I was fortunate enough to be there last week, so I got to experience a bit of the in-person experience, and then also more this week with the virtual participation and joining of events. And I think that linkage needs to be stronger. I think the accessibility needs to be more robust. I think there needs to be ways that we can also have the young voices incorporated into all of these discussions and negotiations and meeting rooms. And this year, UNICEF did try in a big way to try and support that by accrediting a large number of young people to be present and attending in COP and to have access to pavilions that perhaps they may not have had otherwise. So I think there's more to be done. There's surely substantial progress being made, but definitely a lot more needs to be done.
Very much resonate with that. With Restless Development, we've tried to bring young people as well to represent that missing majority, but it's certainly hard with visas and funding and everything else. Not everyone can be here. So if you are watching online, thank you for being with us. We'll move now to some videos, as I think David hasn't joined us yet. They highlight the different actions and solutions that address the impacts of climate crisis in education. So we'll have a series of videos that you can watch now.
Young people around the world are uniting.
We are calling on our governments to recognize
that climate change is not just an environmental issue.
No, it is so much worse than that.
Climate change is a crisis for the rights of children and young people.
Now and into the future.
Climate change makes us poor.
It threatens our access to healthy food and clean water.
It destroys our homes and it pushes us from our homelands.
It takes away our dignity and our lives.
It doesn't have to be like this, but we need world leaders to take action to protect us.
The Declaration on Children, Youth, and Climate Action was given by the perspectives of children and young people from all around the world. And now,
we are using our voice to call on all leaders to sign up to the declaration.
We commit to real, concrete action that will protect our rights and our future.
So please, sign the open letter.
Join with us.
Climate change is happening now, and the young people of today are facing and will continue to face the most pressing climate challenges for years to come.
Based on a Plan International climate change survey of over 1,800 young people from 37 countries, climate change is a universal concern, and most young people want to participate in climate policy processes.
But many don't know about the Paris Agreement or how to get involved in climate processes in their country, and this prevents their voices from being heard.
To help build young people's knowledge and skills for engaging in climate policy, we developed the Youth Leadership in Climate Policy Workbook and Facilitator's Guide.
The Workbook and Facilitator's Guide provide targeted content and activities that help learners turn their knowledge and skills into action for climate empowerment.
Youth leadership is critical in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, as current and future generations of young people will soon be, and already are, leaders in demanding more ambitious action at the national and global levels.
The tools we developed with Plan International are to help young people access climate decision-making spaces and groups, and think critically about their own country's mitigation and adaptation priorities through a rights-based lens.
We integrate climate justice throughout the workbook because it is so central to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement and to transforming social, economic, and political systems.
In the workbook, we use the Paris Agreement and Article 12 on Action for Climate Empowerment as a launch point to introduce national climate policy processes that young people can engage with.
Activities include developing and presenting your own version of your country's nationally determined contribution, conducting a stakeholder mapping of climate actors across power and vulnerability axes, and preparing your own implementable climate policy action plan.
We are so grateful to have collaborated with Plan International, climate change education experts, and youth activists around the world to develop these tools for youth climate action.
We can't wait for the Workbook and Facilitator's Guide to be released and shared widely, and to see how young people around the world engage with them and make them their own. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for more.
As we have heard from Umesh, climate change is seriously impacting children's access to safe, quality education. Building resilient education systems is critical, especially in crisis-prone and low-income countries. Save the Children's Build Forward Better report sets out what can be done to better protect education systems against future shocks, including climate disasters, drawing on lessons from delivering education in emergencies. We learned that by embedding risk management and anticipatory action in the education sector, this can reduce the risks to education and prevent future crises. We call for every country to have a crisis-sensitive education plan and for the funding to fully implement it. As we have discussed today, education is key to advancing the Paris Agreement, yet it is often overlooked. With integrated preparedness plans in place, the education sector can be ready to respond once a crisis occurs and take early action. In doing so, we can prevent future disruptions to learning and equip the next generation with the tools they need to respond to the challenges posed by the climate crisis.
Children's Climate Cards are a new engagement and education initiative on climate change to inspire children to raise their voices. Climate change is disproportionately impacting children, and they have a right to have their voices heard. Endorsed by the Children in a Changing Climate Coalition, the Children's Climate Cards provide a series of fun activities to engage children on climate change and inspire a global children's call for climate action now. Aimed at 7 to 12-year-olds, each card has a specific learning objective following a learning, action, sharing journey. The cards can be used at home, in schools, and in migration camps and centres. So how do the cards inspire children? Children become climate explorers. Travelling on their climate craft across the world, they explore the past, present, and the future. The journey starts at home, thinking about where you live now and imagining it in 30 years' time. Children then complete fun, simple activities to learn about weather, climate, and climate change. Children then explore the global impacts of climate change and extreme weather. They travel to meet different people to learn about how climate change impacts them in different ways. They then map the local impacts of climate change where they live. They explore how nature can play a key role in reducing these impacts and learn about their rights to have their voices heard. It's then on to action. Children hear real-life stories of child and youth-led adaptation to inspire them to act and be climate ready. The cards end with the sharing steps. Children bring all the learning and action together to create their own call for climate action now, sharing it both locally and globally on the interactive world map. The goal is to get a children's call for climate action now from every country in the world. The Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction is coming up in May 2022. Share the cards with children where you live to add their voices to the map and make the call for action louder. Let's make the call so loud that leaders at the next global platform listen. Download the cards from the Children in a Changing Climate website today. Share with children at home, schools, and migration camps and get started with your climate craft journey.
So you've been able to see a series of videos with lots of solutions. And before we jump to that, we have David Boyd on the line. We're glad that you were able to join us. And I know you're meant to start off with your keynote speech, but we'd love to hear you now. So David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and apologies for the technical difficulties. It's apparently quite challenging to join the COP26 virtual platform. What I wanted to say to folks today is that the climate crisis is really a human rights crisis, and one of the most severely impacted groups, perhaps the most severely impacted group, is children and youth. Never before in human history have adults passed on to young people a planet that is so badly damaged. This is an outrageous violation of young people's fundamental human rights, an outrageous and systemic failure of governments to fulfill their legal obligations, and young people have every reason to be upset. Now, today's session is focused on education, and I believe education is like a key that unlocks the door to a better future. All young people, of course, have a right to education, including environmental education. And I personally believe that learning about this beautiful planet, its extraordinary diversity, and its life-supporting systems is every bit as important as learning to read, write, and do math. Ecology and sustainability should be taught at every level, from preschool to university. But how is a child supposed to pursue her education when a hurricane or a flood has destroyed her home or her school? When her family is forced to migrate? How is a child supposed to learn when the temperature is 50 degrees Celsius, or when her parents make her work so that the family can get enough food to survive? How is a child supposed to flourish and learn when her mind is preoccupied by fears about the future of the planet? On my UN mission to Fiji, I met a beautiful little girl, Akiri, who told me she used to love playing on the beach, but now she's afraid of the ocean. It seems angry, she said. I've been speaking about the importance of education for children and youth, but there's another really important point to be made, because all of the young people that I meet love nature, although a few are afraid of spiders and snakes. They understand that the earth is in trouble because of damage caused by humans. They're understandably filled with fear about their future. Adults, on the other hand, are far too often ignorant about the urgency of the climate crisis. They're ignorant about the devastating impacts that climate change is already having on children, youth, and people in vulnerable nations. They're ignorant about their government's total failure to effectively address this crisis over the past 30 years. And they're confused by misinformation about the alleged ineffectiveness of solar energy, wind energy, and electric vehicles. They're tricked by greenwash about net zero 2050, clean fossil fuels, and the promise of nuclear energy. So it's really the adults who need to be educated about the climate crisis. And guess who the best teachers are? Children and youth. Research indicates that teenage girls in particular are extremely effective in conveying environmental information to adults. And my 15-year-old daughter, Meredith, would completely agree. So to every young person listening today, I share your pain, your anger, and your frustration. But I believe in the bottom of my heart that it is not too late. If we give up, we lose. But if we join forces together, if we build a global movement for climate justice, if we continue to flood the streets with protests, if we continue to tell the story of older generations stealing the future from younger generations, we can change the course of history. And change is already beginning. The United Nations recently recognized that everyone, everywhere, has the fundamental human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, a right which includes a safe climate. And some governments, like Costa Rica and France, are beginning to take the steps required. Solar and wind energy are booming. Now, changing the world's energy, transport, and food systems is not going to be easy. But to respect, protect, and fulfill the fundamental rights of children and youth, there is no other option. So, friends and colleagues, let's join forces together and make change happen. Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with you today.
Thank you, David. So before we go back to our panel, we did have a question for you. You're the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. And for you, how are children and young people informing the discussions of these agendas at the UN level, whether it be in Geneva or New York? And what gaps do you see? If you could respond to that in 3 minutes, we'll come back to the rest of our panel in a minute.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I see children and young people having a tremendous influence. For example, that resolution that I mentioned at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, one of the key pressures on that process was the voices of young people and youth who had a My Planet, My Rights petition, which gathered over 150,000 signatures from young people around the world that was presented to the United Nations. At every single event that I organize, I make sure that the voices of youth are represented. So I believe that the voices of youth are getting unprecedented opportunities. The challenge is really to institutionalize these processes and make sure that not only are the voices being having the opportunity, but that the voices are being heard. And I think that's the gap. I think young people are speaking with unprecedented solidarity, but adults are not yet listening to what young people are saying. And so that's why we need to continue to join forces together. Young people working with Indigenous people, with civil society, with UN mechanisms to try and make sure that not only do you have a voice, but that your voice is heard. And I think the next steps in terms of we're going to go to the UN General Assembly to try and get the United Nations there to recognize the right to a healthy environment. Children and youth have a vital role to play in that. I've got amazing experiences where I've met children and youth who are using their rights, using their human rights to bring lawsuits against their governments. And of course, it's a crazy world where children and youth have to sue their own governments to make them fulfill their commitments. But children and youth are having successful in countries from Colombia to Germany, and that's important. We've also got tremendous institutions like the National Children's Parliament in Scotland. And I think we need to lower the voting age around the world so that younger people actually have a voice in their democracies that politicians have to listen to. And we also need young people running for office. So that's just a few thoughts on how young people can actually have even more influence in the future than you're already having today.
Thank you, David. And I could see Amy nodding. And so we're going to continue this discussion on what we can do. And I'd like to turn now to the rest of our panel and talk about the role of education and youth leadership in advancing the Paris Agreement. Again, answers under 3 minutes for all of you now that we have all of you here. Rose, let me come to you first. What is the role of gender transformative education in advancing climate justice? And how can gender be strengthened as part of the ACE program and GAP, which is being reviewed next year?
So I think if anyone heard Nancy Pelosi speak this morning, She said if she ruled the world, what is the one thing that she would do? And the one thing she said she would do would be to educate women and girls. And I think that in itself is a very powerful statement. But it's not just about educating them, it's educating them in a gender transformative way and educating them to advance climate justice. And so when we talk about that in terms of gender transformative education, it's really about making sure through our education we tackle the gender inequalities that exist, that those that exist both in the classroom and in society at large. We have to equip girls with the knowledge and skills that they need to tackle the impact of climate change to ensure that they can participate in adaptation and in the green economy. But if we go back to looking at what gender transformative education is, it really involves re-looking at our education processes right through the whole system of education, through the learning environment, through the curriculum and through the workforce. And I think it's so important that we not only educate women and girls, but we do it in a gender transformative way, because we know that that can be transformational. You mentioned ACE, the Action for Climate Empowerment. You know, on Friday and Saturday, we saw two major protests and marches in the streets with women and girls at the centre in front of those. And on Saturday evening, the subsidiary bodies of ACE held their closing plenary sessions. And unfortunately, the work programme submitted to the subsidiary boards on Saturday does not sufficiently recognise the disproportionate impact of climate on girls' education, nor does it include key actions to support girls' access to quality education. Despite the efforts of civil society, the programme needs to be more progressive and gender responsive. It also did not recognise the power of gender transformation education as a key pathway to climate justice, nor did it give a holistic view of climate education to include civic education, and it did not recognise a rights-based approach. So it is extremely disappointing that while ACE is the only formal place on youth and public participation, not a single CSO was invited during the actual drafting, and many parties were unable to attend the final negotiations. So the work plans adopted are done without CSO input. So there is a strong disconnect between what science is saying, what youth activists are calling for, and what the negotiations are achieving. So, you know, possibly the most important point is that girls and young women must be meaningfully included in the processes, and we've talked about that earlier. Youth must be at the centre of these discussions because this is their future. And we must do better to ensure that girls have a place at the table.
Thank you, Rose. Harjeet, let me come to you. How important are resilient education systems and youth leadership in advancing the loss and damage agenda?
Well, I think we first need to recognize that resilience is failing. You know, the reason we are having this discussion on loss and damage is because we have reached a point where there are limits to adaptation. Science talks about this terminology and also residual impacts. So when we are talking to young people, we have to speak truth. We are late. 30 years of inaction has brought us to a situation where we see impacts all over the place. You know, as David was talking about in his visit to Fiji and other places, we are seeing that in our part of the world, in South Asia, in countries like Malawi. So people are losing their homes, their income, and they do not have any other place to go. So we are also seeing displacement happening. Now, in that context, we have to ramp up our efforts on resilience, on adaptation, but we also have to now, unfortunately, get ready for 1.5 degree or 2 degree warmer world. At least that's what we see from the pledges that have been put on the table. So, of course, we have to keep fighting for, and I totally agree with David, and great to see David. We were together on a session yesterday as well. Hi, David. And I totally agree. We need to see that momentum from youth, and they have to fight it really, really strong. but things are slipping out of hand. So we have to prepare for that as well. So hoping for the best, preparing for the worst, what does that mean? We have to have plans. And the role of education is absolutely vital. When you speak truth, your education system has to change. We have to talk about a world which is going to be a lot more uncertain going forward. It is going to be unpredictable. So what is important? Not prescribing solutions, empowering young people so that they can create their own solutions, because every day is going to be different. So young people, again, and education has to play a very, very important role. And this is the point that I wanted to make, and I'm so glad David talked about. We have to reestablish our relationship with nature. And unless we reform the whole education system, which is just making us robots just to make money and look at GDP, we have to just revamp our system where our relationship with nature is reestablished. Another important thing that education system has to do is to talk about our own lifestyle. Once we reestablish our relationship with nature, we'll start looking at what life are we living? What is our impact on nature? How can we change that? But at the same time, not forgetting that it's not that the choices that we make, but the choices that are being offered to us by the same fossil fuel companies who connive with governments and do not give us enough options, and young people are also stuck with very limited choices, and eventually we become victims of the same economy that has caused the problem. So young people have to change their own lifestyle, but also look at the big picture, the big powers who are not giving them sufficient options. And that's why the marches that we saw on the streets last week are really important to redefine the paradigm itself, and to make sure that we are talking about intergenerational right, our world that young people are going to craft. And again, education system has to be reformed to make that happen.
Thank you, Harjeet. Let's go to Amy, who's still on the line. What role can climate education play in mitigation efforts and supporting a just transition to a low-carbon economy? And what types of skills, capabilities, knowledge, and values do the children need to support this transition?
Yeah, this is another excellent question, and thank you for that. It isn't children's responsibility to mitigate climate change, but education does have a role to play in climate mitigation. In some contexts, only a minority of boys and girls know a lot about climate change, and even where it is taught in other contexts, the majority do not have the deep knowledge for action. UNICEF has a recent report that was launched, The Climate Crisis is a Child's Rights Crisis, which was the Children's Climate Risk Index, and it found that investments that improve educational outcomes can considerably reduce overall climate risk for 275 million children. So while climate education, it helps to develop positive attitudes, behaviors on sustainable choices, and lifestyles, as mentioned by Harjeet just now, and it promotes a sense of ecological responsibility. And it can also increase awareness of the sustainable use of natural resources and about improving food security and changing conditions, both of which have a positive impact on well-being. And then furthermore, education supports the development of green skills, which will be critical for the green transition. And to make the most of this, we must really tackle the gender divide in STEM, with fewer girls and women involved in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and the renewable energy industry. Educating girls and breaking down those gender norms is vital in supporting climate mitigation. Education can also empower children to know and advocate for their rights. And with thanks to David for already making this point so brilliantly, children have a right to the highest attainable level of health as outlined in the UNCRC, and just last month with the Human Rights Council for the first time recognizing this clean, sustainable and healthy environment as a human right through the adoption of the resolution. So knowledge of these rights means that children can advocate for their realization. And at COP, we have seen climate education cropping up in a number of places, and in particular, the ACE negotiations and the Climate and Environmental Ministerial held on November 5th for Youth Public Empowerment Day. And while it's welcome to see such a strong focus on education at COP, there is still more work to be done to ensure that education in a changing climate employs a child's rights approach.
Thank you. Let's go to Chandel here with us in Glasgow. My question to you is, how can climate financing be better invested to protect education from the impacts of the climate crisis and support youth engagement? And what is the role of the social protection in addressing the economic impacts of climate shocks for families and helping children to stay in school? I know that was long.
That's a big question very quickly. Okay, climate finance. I like to say, I want to see use climate finance adaptation as a means for development. So I'm coming from a small island developing state. I want to see us use money to invest in our future as we are adapting to climate change. So that is building schools stronger, but also building our education and changing our curriculum so it's better and more applicable to children in the changing climate that we have. I'll also say, I got a little chain up, but I know I'm a product of a quality education. So I advocate for education in everything, because coming from where I come from, most people will judge me and take me a certain way, but I still have my degree, mechanical engineering with distinction. I wear my ring on my finger. I'm pretty proud of it. I went back to school. So like when life didn't go according to plan, just go back to school. And that's not something everybody can do. So it's only through my education that I would even think of this. Like other people would try to find other ways of life, but I think falling back on school isn't a bad thing if you can find a quality education. And I think that kind of gets into the little issue of like social protection, because also, I come from certain kind of communities where home isn't necessarily a safe place, but school as an institution has always been a kind of a beacon for a lot of people. And with this COVID pandemic, people weren't in school, and there's just a lot of things that fall behind, like access to food, like school provides food for children. So it's just, I think I may have gone a little off topic, but can you just remind me the question again?
Yeah, don't worry at all. It was very interesting, and I think I wrote down you're a product of quality education. I think that's a privilege that many of us have, and if we can advocate for those who don't have it, we can also share that voice. But the question was in terms of financing and how we can better invest in that education.
I also believe in investing in early childhood education. So like I want to see nursery schools, daycares, and everything teaching about sustainability as a way of teaching about like math and science and that kind of thing, because not everybody learns in like books and sitting down in the curriculum, but take a kid outside, plant a tree, you could tell them about photosynthesis, you could tell them about like carbon footprinting by just learning out in the real world. So like that's how I would like to see education, climate finance be used, like in early education, but changing up the curriculum beyond like just studying in a book.
And that goes to what David was saying of starting early, whether it be in voting or in education. I think there's a lot to do in making sure we involve youth. So David, let me come to you. What positive progress has been made at the UN level in Geneva and New York to strengthen the role of education and youth leadership? And how can we highlight the central role of education in equipping young people with skills and knowledge to take climate action and engage in the processes like COP26, where we are now?
Yeah, thank you. I think this event is a great example of how we can strengthen the attention that's paid to education as part of being a climate change solution. But I want to follow up on what Chantal was talking about climate finance and really about money. You know, we have a vision for a better life for all on planet Earth, which is encapsulated in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which youth played a role in articulating back in 2015. And the reality is that vision of a life in harmony with nature, where we end poverty, where everyone has access to education and healthcare, it's an amazing vision for humanity. I mean, imagine if we actually achieved the Sustainable Development Goals. We would have a society that was, you know, living in harmony with the natural world, in which every child had an education and a chance to have a better life. But we're not on track to meet those sustainable goals, and the biggest single barrier is money. You know, rich countries have found $20 trillion to address the COVID-19 crisis. That's been terrific for people in rich countries. Not so terrific because they haven't shared vaccines with people in low-income and middle-income countries. But that kind of money is available, and that's the kind of money we need to be talking about, trillions of dollars. And we're not doing that. You know, we had an announcement last week with the billionaire Bill Gates saying, oh, here's $1 billion. Well, that's frankly peanuts. You know, we need trillions of dollars to address the climate crisis, just the way we have used trillions of dollars to address the COVID crisis. And a lot of that money needs to be spent on the fundamental basic human rights of young people in the global south. The climate crisis has been created by rich people and rich countries. You know, the G20 produces over 80% of greenhouse gas emissions currently, and even more if you look at historically. So those rich countries and rich people, they need to step up to the plate and assist low-income and climate-vulnerable countries in mitigation, adaptation, and we haven't talked about it very much here today. Harjeet mentioned loss and damage. But the reality is, in a country like Dominica, a small island developing state in the Caribbean that's been hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes in the last 7 years, damaging and destroying 90% of their homes and buildings. I mean, how are they going to pay to rebuild schools and rebuild houses so that kids can get an education? We can't expect Dominicans who haven't caused the problem but are suffering from the results of the climate crisis. It's just completely unfair and unjust to think that they should have to pay for that rebuilding process. And so we need loss and damages to start. We need the money to start flowing already now. We've had 30 years of discussion about loss and damages. I mean, most of the young people in this event weren't even born when those discussions started. And yet we still aren't any money flowing under that heading of climate action. So we need to start listening to the small island developing states that are putting forward these creative proposals like an air passenger levy, like a maritime shipping levy, like debt relief. Why? How can we not just forgive the debt of these low and middle income small island developing states and least developed countries? Why are we making them not only pay for the rebuilding from climate change, but pay back the debts that are really left that they have because of colonial governance structures from decades and centuries ago? We need to talk about this climate change issue all the time as a climate justice issue, and we need to pressure rich countries to fulfill their legal and ethical obligations under mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage in order to have funding available in those climate vulnerable countries for education.
Thank you, David. Let's go to Umis. I know you've been waiting for a while since your last question, but my question for you is, what are some key actions or solutions that you'd like to see your government take to make sure that your education isn't impacted?
Yeah, on this historic day of the COP26, that agreeing on some point is a one phase that we are agreeing on some phase for the climate justice. But there is also another part that implementation of all the agreements to the go to the local level and to the local people who are more vulnerable in the society. And for the key action that we should have taken is most primarily the education, because in the most of the developing country, we are back to the education, I mean in the climate education, because we only get the climate change education when we are getting the undergraduate level. So education system should be to implement it from the lower primary to the primary level, because every child and every youth should have the knowledge of climate change, how they are affected and what is going to be in the future. And secondly, for the government should have the pre-planned activities or pre-plans for the climate disaster, because indigenous people and the youth and the people with the disability are on the front line of the disaster. And at the time of the crisis, they are in the front line, because everybody gonna care of their own life. Nobody gonna care the life of the other people, life of the disabled people. So they should have the priority in the rehabilitation, and they should have the priority when they have to take them from out of the danger zone. And also the indigenous people are dependent to the forest or to the nature. After the climate disaster, they lost everything. They lost their home, they lost their food, they lost their everything, agriculture. So after that, the climate crisis, they have to be shifted to the another things. I mean, like green jobs or something another, so they can sustain their life easily for the future. So we should, and one of the things is that I represent to the youth and the indigenous people and with disability from the Hindu-Kush Himalayan region. And as we know, if we also stick on the Paris Agreement, that is 1.5 or below the 2 degrees Celsius, that is not 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius for us. For the countries like Himalayan countries, that will be the more around 3 degrees Celsius. And at the 3 degrees Celsius, we lost our 1/3 of the glass snow of our mountains. We have high diversity in the landscape, because we have the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest, to the lowland. And on this also we are prone to the vulnerable of the climate change. And due to this, we will face the different climatic disasters. So our government, or every local government, or every people should be concerned that we are going to face so many climate disasters. So we have to be prepared for the risks of that. So we should have also concern that while we prepare the building, or while we prepare the structure, physical structure, we should be care about the climate friendly structure. And we should also keep in mind that all the vulnerable people should be the minded on that disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Umis. I can't see any questions coming online, which means that we can have one last round and ask you what your message is. What is the one thing you want to convey? And I'll give you each 1 minute, whether it is to the young women and girls watching, whether it is to people in your countries, whether it is to world leaders. It's up to you who you want to speak to, but what is the message that you want to bring? So, Umis, I can start with
you. Yeah, I am 26, and COP26 is here. And I want to win this race, leaving the COP26 behind, and a successful COP26. In the late 80s of my age, I want to die with peaceful, in my bed with peaceful, not rather than suffering from the climate change disaster, but I want to die peacefully in my bed in my late 20s. And my last wish at that time, when I will be on my bed in late 80s, then I will thank to those all the powerful leaders, all to the person who are in the power, the policy making, that they have made my life peaceful, because making the successful COPs are making our future bright. So I want us to say the old leaders that we are watching you. Youth are watching to all the old leaders, and you should heart us, and you must heart us. And we will surely rewrite the history that how will you make our future. And as our favorite artist said, that solving the climate change issue is not just a political issue, it is our own survivals. So to the old leaders, we, the youth from all over the world, watching you and concern our issue, and together we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harjeet. Hard act to follow, but please, what is your message?
My message is to young people and not world leaders. I think world leaders know what they have to do. Young people have been telling them. I would like to tell young people, demand system change and really understand the tenets of climate justice that's based on equity and science, and really important for you to mobilize, come together, to define your future and claim it. You have the power. Just do it.
Amazing. Thank you. Chandel, what would you like to say?
Well, I'll go back to my usual tagline: when you can do more, do more. So if you can act and you can try to take on climate action and everything, please take it on. And when it comes to education, to live is to learn. Just because you come out of school doesn't mean you have to stop learning. There are different ways to learn: informal, formal education. Just keep on trying and don't worry about it too much. Just keep learning. You have the internet, you have friends, you have networks. You could just always continue to learn. There's no such thing as being too educated. Like, what, you're scared of learning too much? Nah, doggies. Things are always changing. So please continue to learn and continue to try, I guess.
Thank you. I love your taglines. No such thing as being too educated. Rose, over to you.
Yeah, my message is to those who are decision makers is to act now and find the financing now to create, I want a world where my children can have a sustainable future. And to act now, you have to put young people and the voices of girls and young people right at the center of that decision making. Girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, and we need to change that, and we can do it in many ways, but girls and young people need to be at the center of that decision making, and we need the funding to make the difference.
Thank you. Amy, online, do you have one last message?
Yeah, my message is also for the young people, and it's really to say thank you. Thank you for inspiring us. every day, your energy, your ideas, your commitment. I think for me, for certain, that re-energizes me every time that I'm engaging with young people and with children on this agenda. And we recognize your efforts. And you know, adults and world leaders, we do have to do better. So I think my main message is don't give up, keep demanding the urgent action on this agenda as you have been doing. And, you know, to echo what Rosa said, the decision makers do need to act now.
Thank you. And David, over to you for the last remarks.
Well, I love what all my colleagues have said, and I'll just say, governments and world leaders, listen to youth and do what they're telling you. Rich people in rich countries, share your wealth, and young people, boys and girls, like Christiana Figueres says, be stubborn optimists. Together, we can overcome these seemingly daunting challenges by working together, by compassion for each other, and by loving this beautiful planet, which we're so lucky to call home.
Thank you so much for this rich discussion today. I've heard things ranging from education to very small kids to education to world leaders. I think we all need to be educated on this topic, and I've certainly learned a lot today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you as well to the organizations that organized this talk. And to all of you watching online, do continue this conversation. If you're watching today and you've learned something, share it on social media or share it with your family, and make sure that we keep this conversation going on how education and climate relate to each other and how we can be actors in that change. We finished just 5 minutes ahead of time, so that gives you enough time to do that right now. Thank you so much, everyone.